The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Today's episode is The Invitation of Uncertainty.
Good morning, everyone. It's Wade Franson here with episode 203. Can you imagine? Of Created in the Image of God. We just keep rolling, and the guests just keep getting better. I'm here actually pre-recording because my guest is in the UK, and it would have been an awkward hour for him, even though I assume he has had the occasional late night staying up, given the amount of research and writing and accomplishment our distinguished guest this morning has. Welcome to the studio, Mark Vernon.
Hi there, Wade. Thanks for the invitation indeed, and very good to join you on your long-standing discussions. I hope indeed fresh insights and thoughts might emerge in the next hour.
I am certain they will, and also deep thoughts, not in the Norm Macdonald Saturday Night Live humorous version, but actual deep thoughts, because your research has been deep. I mean, we just talked about how to try to condense your massive bio into something manageable and bite-sized here, but we'll just unpack it as we go. I'm not even going to build you up. The proof is in the pudding, as we just discussed, but let the audience get to know the real you, your own creation story, right? Your parents and growing up in, I believe it was the northeast of England. And tell us what it was like to be little lad Mark and the forces that shaped you before you took conscious thought.
I guess I was always destined to be engaged with the religious side of life, the big questions, you might say. My father was a curate in the northeast of England in a place called Barnard Castle, where I was born, so near Durham with its wonderful cathedral, and the land of saints like St Cuthbert, Lindisfarne, the famous Holy Island. And so that air, I think, did enter my lungs, and its spiritual air did enter my psyche from, my first moments, really. I do sort of feel that County Durham is home, and I have lived there off and on for periods of my adult life, although now I live in London. And
what is a curate? What was it that your father actually did?
Yeah, so he worked in the Church of England, and it was his first job as a vicar, a priest in the Church of England, and that's called a curacy. So he did that, and then he joined the army. Actually, he became a military chaplain, and so much of my young life was spent in other parts of the UK and also in Germany, because the British military presence, alongside the American, was still very big in Germany through the 1970s, the 1980s.
Yeah, let's slow down just a little bit. I want to unpack a couple things. And by the way, this is wonderful and fascinating. I'm curious and I'm loving this. So, as a chaplain in the military, was he focused on Church of England members, or did he more broadly serve different? Let's say there were, Hindus in the military. I don't know, or how does that work?
Yeah, so the Anglican chaplains, Church of England chaplains, they will look after people that are members of the Church of England, but there's always a sense with the Church of England, because it's the established church in the UK, that it opens its doors to anyone. So there would be Catholic chaplains, there would be nonconformist chaplains. I mean, back then, I don't know quite what the status would have been for like Hindu chaplains and so on. But yeah, the sense of being an Anglican is that you look after people who are Church of England, but you do more besides.
Yeah. And then in Germany, where in Germany?
So in the north of Germany, so that was the British military sector. So in between the cities of Hamburg and Hanover, particularly, Nordrhein-Westfalen is the German name for the region.
Yep, I lived in Germany for 10 years. That's the curiosity. Just slightly after you, I moved there in 1984.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, actually, I think we were there. I mean, I sort of was beginning to leave home, of course, but my parents were still there in the late 1980s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So I was in Bonn, also in Nordrhein-Westfalen.
Yeah.
And it was the provisional capital at the time.
Yeah. Well, we used to come down to the American sector, just that little bit further south, because the American military brings not only all its hardware, but everything that you need to live besides. And so visiting the American PX was always a very exciting thing. You know, you could get American goods that you couldn't get in England at that point. So yeah, the sort of sense of the excitement of living not just in a foreign country, Germany, which I only have good feelings for. It felt a very rich place to live. The food was more interesting, and of course, it's always more interesting when you're aware of another language and culture around you. But the other side of it was the sense of the American presence, actually, and you know, the wealth in all the senses of that word that you could access.
Yeah, Germany had almost a quicker, resurgence and rise in the wake of World War II, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of Germany under the Marshall Plan. But so you were exposed to all this. So now how was this shaping you then? And where did you go, how did you sort of come of age?
Well, the other big influence would have been my schooling, because I went to a boarding school, which was, common amongst military kids. And that was, I found that very mixed. It was a very aggressive, quite traditional boarding school at the time. And so it's left me with even now a residual kind of wariness, being careful about who knows what, and what threats there might be. I work as a therapist now, and that's been a big part of my liberation, really, from that side of boarding school. But on the other hand, the sense of belonging to a community, the sense of life and its possibilities. I always did well academically, so I was affirmed in that way. And the religious element kept going, because it was a Church of England Foundation boarding school. And so I was very involved with the music, particularly of the college chapel.
Yeah, so growing up in sort of an institution like that, did you just immediately assimilate everything that you learned with the mother's milk and with your father's, under your father's protective umbrella in the military and his involvement? Or did you question this, that, and the other thing?
I did certainly question, but probably not until later, probably not until after I left school. The ideas side of things always fascinated me. And but there was the skepticism in the sense of wanting to understand more deeply rather than dismissing. And when I left school and went to Durham University, back up to the northeast, I did physics there. And that was the first time, I think, that I really began to question things religiously. I was never an atheist, but I did go through periods of agnosticism and got picked up again by the local bishop in Durham, who I knew because of sort of mutual friends or something like that. And that's what nudged me towards another very important moment, which was getting ordained in the Church of England. So I was, for a while, the curate myself. I did this first 3-year period in a Church of England parish in the northeast of England. But then things really fell apart for me. I mean, on the one hand, personally, I got very lonely. It was the first time I'd lived alone, and I come from a very large family. Perhaps I should say that as well. I'm the eldest of 6 children, so the idea of being in a house on your own for the first time was a real shock. Actually, I had no idea what a shock that would be. But then also, what I didn't realise until I was actually ordained was that when you wear a dog collar, this item of clothing that Church of England clergy wear, and Catholic priests as well, you become an ambassador for the institution. And then I remember feeling, gosh, there's this kind of mask on my face that's called the church. And it felt very uncomfortable. And in retrospect, I didn't really have a vocation to be a priest, but at the time, I didn't really have the imagination to know how to express my interest in spirituality and religion otherwise.
Yeah.
So I got sort of rather caught in this curiosity, but then left. So that only actually lasted for 3 years.
Now, is celibacy part of that experience in the Church of England, or no?
No, that's not a part of the Church of England setup at all.
Okay.
So yeah, you're free to pursue family life and so on. Yeah.
And on a personal level, was that something that you pursued or not?
Not at that stage. No, I met my partner much later.
Okay. So I'm having a little bit of an affinity here with this, because as you describe your own experience of being in and then out of that priest role, I was an ordained minister, different from a priest, but still, I mean, very much similar in terms of how many of the parishioners view you. I would say there's definitely a difference philosophically between a priest and a minister, and organizationally what our sort of credential really is, and our purpose even to a degree. But in our denomination, yeah, we still ministered rites, if you will, right? We didn't have communion, but we in our particular sort of off-center denomination, we kept the Passover once a year, and that's when communion would happen, right? The symbols of the bread and the wine once a year at Passover, along with the foot washing. So we oversaw that. In that sense, we administered it, but not as a priest, as a servant. And there's a difference. Having said all that, I felt that same, loneliness, in that people would look to me really almost to make decisions for them, almost, wanting me to query God on their behalf they wanted to query me rather than query God, for guidance and whatnot. And I didn't like it. And I would try to point people away from me and to the Bible and to prayer and fasting, and you know what I mean? And ultimately that's part of why I resigned. Respond to that. Was some of that going on intellectually, emotionally with you, or how, how the relations with other people?
Yeah, the Church of England has this spectrum of different kinds of what used to be called churchmanship, more lower sort of Protestant. I mean, there are clergy in the Church of England that will call themselves ministers, for example, rather than priests. But I was from the high church end, so with ritual, with colour, with incense, and therefore to be a priest was to be the administrator of these rituals and rites, sacraments. And that has its downside, of course, because they can become dead, but it has its upside, which is that there isn't so much to focus on you as a person, but more on what you're administering. I mean, there is still the function of preaching, and actually that was the one thing in a way that I discovered I enjoyed, was talking. And I subsequently became a journalist, and in fact writing a sermon is quite similar to writing an article in a magazine or a newspaper, about 1,500 words that have a punch straight, from the get-go and so on. So that was the one bit that I did take into what happened subsequently. But whilst in the church, I could, it was a catch-22, because on the one hand, the rites and the rituals that you perform that really help people. I mean, it's very obvious that, particularly say funerals, you quite quickly start taking funerals very regularly, and they're very powerful rituals that help people enormously. But you're also behind the screen with this mask on in order to offer that. And so I remember one particular incident where I was walking down the street in the town where I was working, and a woman who I subsequently got to know just a little bit, who was a single mother, and she saw me coming in a dog collar, and I saw her looking down in shame, and I suddenly realized that that's another side of the institution, that it can help people, but it can also inject a huge sense of guilt and alienation and shame into people because of all the assumptions that people have about a God. And now, of course, in England, the Church of England is very much on the wane. Very few people go to church now. And if you mention God or the church, it's changing perhaps a little bit. Maybe we'll come on to this, but nonetheless, there's still quite often a sense of anger. And I think that a generation or two on, that guilt that the church wittingly or unwittingly instilled in people, it's kind of payback time now a bit, and people are rejecting the church therefore.
Yeah, well, this has been a great sort of intro. We're going to go to a quick commercial break, which will feature a little video, if God willing and the creek don't rise, about you and your role now today. When we come back, we'll dive into that. Don't go anywhere. We'll have more with Mark Vernon on Creating the Image of God in a moment.
I was born in County Durham, the so-called land of the Prince Bishops, with its famous, astonishing cathedral in the city of Durham, where I also went to university. And the presence of St Cuthbert is much remembered in these parts, not least in the vast expanses of Northumberland and Lindisfarne, and I'm sure that this deeply affects my spirituality and sense of yearning. There's the nature of the place too, of course. I was even ordained for a while at St Cuthbert's, Billingham, a church now under threat of closure. But I'd say that my spirituality nowadays is as much in the land, in ancient traditions, other traditions too, from India and elsewhere, and thinking about how the divine dwells within us as much as we in the divine.
Welcome back to the main attraction of today's show. Let's, to reference that old, you won't know about this, Mark, but there was a very famous Wendy's commercial years ago here in the US. Where's the beef, right? So now we're going to talk about where the beef is, right? The beef being, the meat of it. So you continued to study, you continued to accumulate degrees and write books, and your curiosity led you into William Blake, spiritual intelligence, Dante, and your writings have appeared in outlets like the BBC, Aeon, the Church Times, and Idler, where you have a regular column. So share with us a little bit of that deepening, that maturing around your rounding out, coming from having had a stint in the church, performing those rites, to now broader intellectually in the broader world.
Well, when I was training to be a curate, I did a theology degree and studied at Oxford, and it was a great time to be there. There were many incredible thinkers. Perhaps the best known still is Rowan Williams, who was an Archbishop of Canterbury, but is a very brilliant writer on matters spiritual and theological. He's one of these figures who it's coming from a living place within him, and so you receive a transmission as much as anything else. And so studying with him and others in Oxford really affirmed for me that whilst I'd done physics to start with, theology was much more my métier. And so that was wonderful to realize. When I left the church, I needed something that was broader than just Christianity. And so my PhD became on Plato, so ancient Greek philosophy. One particular dialogue of Plato that kind of gives those baggy qualifications a focus, but nonetheless made me very aware of what's called the Neoplatonic tradition, which is sometimes said to be like the underground river that throws up all the springs and streams that feed the Abrahamic religions and all sorts of other facets of Western culture, actually. So it was wonderful to touch that at source. And that PhD actually led me to write my first themed book, which was on friendship. I wrote a book called The Meaning of Friendship. And when I left the church, I'd started doing a lot of journalism. Actually, as it happened, it was in business and technology that I did a lot of journalism. I started writing for the Financial Times because there was a lot of that kind of journalism to write at that time. But I knew I didn't want to become an expert indefinitely in that area, and so the book came out on friendship, and that gradually pivoted me more towards writing about psychological, philosophical, spiritual, sort of the way of life kind of stuff, beginning with friendship and moving into other areas like love, and then subsequently, like you were saying there, focused almost on figures two or three of the great spiritual figures of the Western canon, you might say, like Dante, like William Blake. So yeah, the writing and the journalism, and then that also, you know, leads to public speaking, and then subsequently, more recently, things like podcasting and so on. It all emerged after I left the church.
So Dante's a household name still even today. Perhaps was more of one earlier in my youth, but then we have a caricature of Dante, right? His Inferno. So in the Dante for Dummies world, how would you share your overview of Dante that maybe goes beyond the Inferno?
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote my book on Dante, I wanted very much to make sure that I wrote quite as much about the Paradiso and the Purgatorio as the Inferno, because so often people kind of get hell, but it seems a tragic commentary on our times that people say they just don't understand the paradise. But broadly speaking, I think what Dante's doing is, on the one hand, spelling out, you know, in lots of detail and color, a perennial theme in wisdom traditions, which is that the way down is the way up. It's only when you've encountered the darkness that you can really give yourself to the light. It's only when you know of the hate and the envy and so on that is truly powerful, that you can trust that love is stronger. And so Dante's descent into the hell, and then the climb up Mount Purgatory, which is the sort of the place where he realizes and sees more clearly, the veils of ignorance get lifted, is all a preparation for entering the paradise. Because to enter paradise properly, I think you need to be able to say yes to the whole of life. Not I want that bit, but don't want that bit. That is going to keep you sort of trapped on the terraces of Mount Purgatory. But when fear is replaced wholly by love, and when there can be shade and nuance and even difficulty and suffering, but you know that the light and the love are stronger, that's when you really start to enter the paradisal frame of mind. And so I think that's really what the Divine Comedy is doing. It's saying hell exists, but hell is a place of people's own making. And sure enough, you know, I work in mental health. Hell is definitely a place that people get trapped in. But I think Dante is showing us that the paradisal divine source is stronger than all that. And so although it can seem paradoxical when, as you say, you take just the Divine Comedy 101, I think Dante is a universalist. He believes that all things can only go to their source, return to God. So all will be saved. God will be all in all, as St. Paul puts it. But you can only really affirm that when you've taken the darkness seriously. And then you know that the light is stronger.
Well, speaking of the darkness, and I'm gonna dwell on this for a little bit because this is fascinating to me. I've spent a lot of time in the book of Genesis. It's probably my favorite book, and even just the first couple of chapters, right? So you've got two creation stories, right? You've got the cosmic view where you have a God, and it's often thought that, you know, Genesis chapter 1 shows God creating ex nihilo, right? But that's not actually the full story there, because the primordial waters, the darkness, as you called it in that view, pre-exists God in that first story. The Spirit of God hovers above that primordial darkness. And there are those who say that, you know, oh, well, obviously Genesis 1 is cribbed from those Mesopotamian ancient, you know, creation stories. And I would say, well, you know, chicken and the egg, right? Which really came first, and who cribbed it from who and how and what? But there's one view of Genesis 1 in which it's cleaned up. So I have behind me this constant reminder, the sun and the moon. But they're not called the sun and the moon in Genesis 1. They're called the greater and lesser lights. And one theory is this is the redactor, the editor, cleaning it up to remove the idea that God, the creator, created any false gods. And it had nothing to do with them. They, you know, when he created them, there was no idea of the sun god or the moon god, because even in those ancient languages, those words evoke those deities, right? But this primordial water existed. You follow me? And part of what this does is it gets God off the hook for creating evil. However, in Genesis 2, we see that same being that is very hands-off speaking, and it is, right? Separating creating order out of chaos, separating the waters from the earth, the heavens from the heavens, and so on. Then you see this being kneeling down in the dirt and with his own hands taking dead, inert dust, shaping it into a form, and then breathing CPR-like breath into this thing. A very different view of God. And this God introduces the serpent, who obviously was created by God in the garden. So very different view, very different story. And this is what was being evoked in me when you're talking about Dante's descent into hell and the climb back out and the need to understand this, because clearly and obviously God knew and expected we would eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And one more point before I give the mic back to you. If we fast forward and look at the Apostle Paul, he endorses the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He endorses the fall because he says strong meat belongs to those who by reason of use have exercised their senses to discern good and evil. Clearly indicating that, you know, as much as it sucks to exist in the world of the school of hard knocks and have no way out, but to take the tests before you even know what the lesson is, because you take the test with God and the lesson comes later. You don't get the lesson first, right? In the school of hard knocks, the test comes and later you learn the lesson you should have known to avoid the test. But Paul says, hey, it's all part of the plan. Maturity is you've exercised your senses, good and evil, pain and pleasure, to discern good and evil for your own self with your free will. There's a lot there, but I'll throw the mic back to you after that.
I mean, this is where a figure who you mentioned at the top, Owen Barfield, comes in for me. So Barfield was one of the Inklings. So he was best pals with C.S. Lewis and was also so very influential on J.R. Tolkien. Both Lewis and Tolkien said that Barfield had the best ideas, but he's not nearly so well known because he wasn't such a brilliant writer. But Barfield, he really came to my rescue, actually. And so this is a bit of personal story, but then coming back to particularly the issues you raise in relation to Genesis. So when I finished my PhD on Plato, I felt, I mean, I got the PhD, but I felt I hadn't really got to terms or seen even really the living Platonism that had fired civilizations for millennia. You know, I'd studied it analytically, but not tasted the spirit. And Barfield makes a comment in one of his books, someone pointed out to me, where he says people can read the whole of Plato and even write books about him and not have understood a first word. And I thought that's quite a strong thing to say, but Barfield's point is that over the 2,500 years since Plato was writing, words change meaning. And it's not just that we get better at defining words, but the very processes of thought change as well. So take a word like theory, theoria in Greek. In Plato's time, it really meant a kind of pilgrimage, a journey you went to a horizon, then you saw over the horizon and a new revelation came to you. Whereas now, of course, a theory means a proposal that you put to the test. That's the scientific understanding. So the point is you can read theoria in Plato and not have at all understood what he's driving at because you take a modern assumptions to it. Now this bears on.
Do not lose your thought, but I've got to interject. I have frequently used the phrase that I'm a mad scientist who injects himself with his own serum, but that's why I put my theories to the test by taking the journey that's necessary to find out if they're true or not. Anyway, back to you.
Yeah, but see, so that there you see you have a very particular anthropology. It's like me as an individual, you as an individual need to put to the test the ideas that we have about the world, belief, and so on. Now that's an idea that's really been only focused since the Reformation, about 500 years ago. Right. That really became the dominant view. I mean, you can even point to it actually in the 1520s. Both new Protestant churches and the Catholic Church start printing endless catechisms, like the lists of things you have to believe. And so there's an assumption there about the individual. And that's just to complete the thought, because, you know, what you believe and don't believe is really a symptom of a deeper sense of what it is to be a human. Whereas I think the reason why Plato is so fascinating to us, and this comes back to what you're saying about Genesis, is that Plato and then subsequently Christianity and the figure of Christ in particular are starting to catalyze and then crystallize a sense of individuality that you and I might recognize. Whereas before, you get, this is very explicit in Homer, but I think it's also explicit in the earlier traditions in the Hebrew Bible that get, of course, edited and moved around as the ancient Israelites literally move around into Babylon and then back again. But nonetheless, there's a sense there of a kind of collective consciousness that was the earlier experience of what it was to be human. So as it were, your identity didn't reside inside your chest, as Shakespeare puts it. It resided in your tribe or in your place. And the as it were, the withdrawal of consciousness that enables you and I to think of ourselves as individuals is in a way the story of the Bible. And so you can read these different traditions that are threaded together into particularly the book of Genesis. I mean, there's standard biblical scholarship, I think, now that Genesis has at least 4 different kind of traditions woven within it, and no doubt more besides. But to read them as, and ask yourself the question, you know, what kind of sense of what it was to be human, and also therefore what kind of sense of the divine is implicit in this particular text, in this chapter. And to address your point directly, my understanding therefore of Genesis 1 and 2 is that these were 2 different senses of the divine that were really, although Genesis is actually quite a late bit of the Hebrew Bible, strangely enough, even though it's the first bit of the Hebrew Bible when you read it, it's sort of, it's before the full monotheism has emerged. It's still you know, the God of the Hebrews who dwells on Mount Zion, that's still more or less the dominant sense. Yahweh on the way to becoming the only God, but at that moment, the supreme God amongst other gods. And so there is a sense, as you're saying, that this, as it were, one God amongst many, it's sometimes called, I can't remember the technical name now, but anyway, of course, therefore, there's going to be something before that one God amongst many, because it's not an original God. It's not the God that creates everything out of nothing. That comes later. Actually, you know, maybe only 500-600 years before Christ. Sometimes people point to sections in the latter bit of the book of Isaiah where you get full monotheism finally emerging. Yeah, so the idea that God is more like a demiurge hovering over what would have been called the pleroma, the kind of undifferentiated mass, and then drawing the forms of creation out of that undifferentiated primordial stuff. You know, that fits with an earlier story, and you get it in other Mediterranean traditions as well. You get it in Plato, and what happens before in Plato as well. Hesiod's Theogony, for example, has a similar kind of idea. But the point is, to try and crystallize things, is that when you have this sense of the evolutionary sense of things, which isn't just ideas changing, but the very perception of what it is to be human and what it is to know God and the rest of the natural world changing, particularly from a kind of outside in experience, which I think our deep ancestors had, to an inside out, which is what we have. And coupled to that, a sense of the one supreme God, monotheism, who you need to have a sense of your own individuality, because that oneness needs to be reflected in your own sense of oneness. You know, if you regard yourself as sort of dispersed through your group, you're going to see polytheistic deities round and about, because everything is dispersed. But it's only when you have a tight enough sense of yourself that you can know the one God. And I think this is why Christ is so important, because Christ is the figure who can say not only I am as a human, but I am as the divine incarnate as well. And so that's why Christianity spreads, I think. It finally crystallizes what had been unfolding for some centuries before.
Wow, so fascinating, and so much. We're We're going to have to take another quick break, but I can see too, and I hope you'll be open to perhaps returning to the show to unpack some of this, because this is just I'm loving this. I hope the audience is as well. Two quick thoughts come to mind for you to think about while we go to a quick break. What you just said about Jesus, I've been thinking a whole lot too about that, and the Christ, and in the beginning was the Word. Because you've got that creation view that comes in John. Excuse me. But I was just trying to explain to my daughter, who's a teenager, right? And the teenage mind is beginning to get that sense of self, but is having, and it was a minor little thing, right? It had to do with a pickup of her car, and should she try to change, because she's a senior in high school, she drives herself. And long story short, I just said, look, you're looking at what makes it easier for you. And I'm trying to address what makes it easier for everybody, right? And what would be easiest for you would cause a lot of other people to have to go to a lot of effort. And Jesus said, think not, let this mind be in you which was in Christ Jesus, first of all. And also think not more highly of yourself, to think more highly of others, but then also don't think just about the things of yourself, but think about the things of others. So we have this yin yang back and forth of what you're just describing about our sense of self and that wholeness, but also an awareness, right? And so on a broader scale, when you were talking about the Enlightenment and how the idea came of viewing things more from within and from a personalized level, we've now got the dehumanizing effort of aspects of big data, where you are now pigeonholed as in the upper half of the 95th percentile, right? And every imaginable human condition now has a name, and they will analyze you and say you have this whatever disability, divergent mental capacity. And we are sliced and diced and told what we are by big data. And what you think and feel is irrelevant, because big data tells you what you actually are. And increasingly, like this came up under COVID and people's perceptions there, any personal individual experience was just totally denied and canceled in favor of the meta narrative that had to be true, right? And individualized treatments and what was and wasn't happening in the hospital bed, in the hospital room, was completely denied in favor of there is this one narrative that at the highest levels we have decided. And I'm not actually commenting on the right or wrong of what was or wasn't done. I'm just saying you've got this dynamic evolving through history as we evolve and as we try to figure out what is the role of the individual, what is the role of an institution, right? We talked earlier about the priest and his role and what he does, and the fact that the Church of England and churches all over are in decline because of the distrust and the mistrust and the broken social contract between what the church was supposed to provide and didn't provide, or whatever institution, right? So the individual, the institutions, and the community, what are those respective roles, and how do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I'll put a pause button there and let you respond to that when we come back from this commercial break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to have the concluding segment of Mark Vernon on the Created in the Image of God show today.
Everyone wants a better future, but how do we get there? Throughout history, laws have been a guide, but somewhere along the way, ego and greed took control. What happens when law loses its connection to fairness and humanity? It's time to reconnect justice and freedom, to rebuild systems that support balance and prosperity for everyone. Economic justice isn't about control, it's about cooperation. And when we embrace it, incredible things happen. This book is your invitation to think differently, to see how freedom can lead to balance, and balance can lead to peace. The answers are simpler than you think. Let's find them together. Liberty and Justice of Economic Equilibrium by Bruce Kerber. Available now.
Welcome back. Just before the break, I had posed a bunch of sort of stray and random thoughts in my head to Mark to get his perspective on the things that were impacting me from what he was unpacking earlier.
There's a lot in all this, and I would love to talk more extensively another time, but maybe just pick up on this way, bring us more into modern times, and particularly the Georgian period. So a couple of hundred years ago, time of the American War of Independence, the height of the British Empire, the beginnings particularly too of modern science, really taking the form that we know it now. And one of the switches which occurs then actually is that the sense of truth starts to take on what we would now call its objective quality. So we now work with an assumption that if you want to know the facts about something, if you want to know the right theories in the modern sense, you have to extract yourself from it and, as it were, look on, study, observation, evidence, proof, and so on are all the things that matter. But 300 years ago, for example, that would have been thought a bit facile, because that's only to measure the surface of things, and the truth of things was really found by their interiority, their subjectivity, and their essence. And this all goes back at least to Aristotle and beyond. And so contemplating the true nature of something would have been to participate in its life, to harmonize with it. You know, intellect didn't mean a kind of dry abstraction. It meant a knowing in the sense of understanding the dynamics, the way of life, because you shared in it. And so this is one of the big switches that Barfield and others were onto that's occurred quite recently, actually. And so now, in an age of the silicon chip, the transistor, this extraordinary computer power, you know, moving at the speed of light through printed circuit boards, able to deal very, very marvelously with enormous amounts of data, there's a whole preparation that makes the world ready for that. It's a bit like if you had a car but there were no roads, the car would be completely useless no matter how fancy the car. Similarly, there's a whole kind of interior landscaping that has to go on in order for these extraordinary things called the modern computer to have purchase on our lives. And in particular, that which is objective needs to be valid much more than that which is subjective. So, you know, in terms of what you were saying just before the break, we have to value the process, you might say, more than the personal. And also, I think the way that commands, order, law, rule, technology needs that too, because it needs programming. And the modern world is structured by a kind of legal framework, a bureaucracy that's enabled by technology to an extent that would have shocked and, you know, more than surprised most humans for most of history. I mean, in the ancient Greek world, for example, the word for law, nomos, really means much more kind of customs and traditions, patterns of living that bring people together, not what Francis Bacon, you know, it's a very important figure for the emergence of modern science, switched and called lex from the Roman for law, which was the word that the Roman general would use to command their troops. So now we understand nature to be obeying abstract necessities, not in some kind of dynamic communion, participating with the life of all things. So again, this sort of, when you have this sense of the evolution of the modern consciousness that's happened even in the last 200 or 300 years, then very particular crises, such as you were referring to with COVID, of course, in the middle of the crisis, that which you trust the most is that which you turn to, which is the objective process, rather than, and it can, in a crisis, readily overwrite the personal engagement. So I think that, you know, what we felt 5 years ago and are still working out and trying to understand is part, I think, of a more general shift of consciousness that's saying, you know, have we got this right? A world that allows the algorithmic such purchase for all the good things that it brings, because clearly it brings astonishing things as well. Do we need a kind of correction? Do we need an adjustment? And figures like Barfield would say we do. And in fact, there's already a dynamic at play that's working that out. And you can understand that dynamic much better when you understand how the situation currently arose in the first place, because that brings a kind of freedom through an understanding that recognizes the space in order to move into a different tomorrow and to participate in that change, you know, rather than just going down the route of either firefighting, sort of whack-a-mole, trying to prevent symptoms popping up again and again, you know, or of course the, you know, the conspiracy, the rage, whatever else that is so prevalent in our times as well. This spiritual analysis, I think, is absolutely fundamental.
Well, thank you. I want to switch the tone. I want to continue this topic, but from a completely different sort of tone, and dive more into the psychological side by the use of monsters as a metaphor. This is how I suggest we conclude this show, to have a bit of fun with it, just to explore, right? So monsters, you know, Shelley's Frankenstein, everybody knows that, okay, that was, you know, the machine age, the Industrial Revolution, and that was the appropriate monster for that time, right? Technology gone wild and crazy. Vampires are an interesting monster, right? Completely different dynamic going on, sucking the life out of other people, can't see themselves in the mirror, right? There's a whole nother thing, and I've used the analogy of vampires a lot to describe some of the stuff that goes on. I was in a situation once where it was clear that the person who was ministering and serving, and his heart was good and he was respected and loved, but he was actually a spiritual vampire who was sucking the spiritual energy out for his own idea of his own calling, which was necessary, and he was doing it in a loving way, but nonetheless, you follow me? But the monster that I want to talk about here is the zombie, right? The modern monster, where the other zombies eat your brains, and now you mindlessly pursue the same goal, which is to eat other people's brains, right? This is a monster that's had a long run now, and it seems like a fitting and appropriate monster. So from a psychological perspective, do these different monsters sort of give us the ability to detach and objectively look at things while also adding a bit of levity while retaining gravity, or, you know, seriousness, because monsters are monsters?
I love the discussion of monsters. Chimeras are the ones that I particularly like, but sticking with zombies and referencing the Divine Comedy. So in the Inferno, Dante and Virgil encounter zombies, or at least they encounter the souls that are in the afterlife that have left the empty bodies, the zombies, living on Earth. It's a very low circle of hell, near to the heart of frozen hell itself. But what's fascinating about that is that Dante realizes in paradise that zombies are a tragic, disastrous perversion of a truth. And this is a general principle that's in Dante and actually mainstream Orthodox Christianity as well, that evil is always a perversion of the truth, of what's good, what's beautiful. The ugly is a distortion. It's not something that has a life of its own. It's a failure to achieve life in some way. And I mean, I think you mentioned this phrase earlier on, actually. Paul will tell us, let the mind of Christ be within you. And he'll say of himself, I no longer live, but Christ lives within me. Now that is the true replacement, or at least I shouldn't really say replacement. That's the true discovery, right, of your humanity, where your own mind is actually part of the bigger divine mind. Yeah. And the zombie, therefore, is a kind of perversion of that, where the mind is just removed into a kind of automaton. And I think these monsters, chimeras, zombies, they all have their divine correlates. And so whenever people mention monsters and so on,
we could throw the Borg from Star Trek into this mix, which is a different version of that, right? Anyway, go ahead.
No, I think that, you know, when people play the Frankenstein cards to make you terrified of modern technology, there's a truth and a warning in that. But ask yourself, people rarely ask the next question, you know, because it's also, you know, Mary Shelley also references Prometheus in the title of Frankenstein. And Prometheus is the human that steals the fire from God, but that finds the way to the gods as well. And so asking ourselves, what are we really searching for in the development of these technologies? And can that very search remind us of the perennial truth, the perennial wisdom, which is that we don't need the technology to find the divine, because the divine is always already within us. And then the technology can serve us. It needn't become monstrous. It can just become another tool. But I think when we forget, and another word that's very telling in this discussion, I think, is the word transhumanism. Because again, transhumanism is now a word that's being co-opted by the tech bros, saying that what you need is the technology to extend and remove human vulnerability, even death itself. But Dante is the coiner of the word transhumanism. Again, when Dante is about to enter the paradise, he says, and now I must transhumanize. And what he means there is he must discover the divine within him, that is the source of his humanity, but also exceeds his humanity. And when he's able to do that, he's able to rise into paradise. So always look for the truth, even in the midst of the darkness. That would be the general principle.
Well, we're out of time, and I desperately want to have you back, but I will give you now one more moment to just sort of wrap up. What do you want to leave the audience with today after today's session?
Maybe another reflection on this similar thing, that I feel another dynamic that is very dominant is the sense that somehow life is scarce, it's fragile, it's going to fall apart. There's a meta crisis, collapse, is coming our way. And I think this is because we've lost touch with the truth of reality, which is that it's abundant. God constantly pours out into the creation, and life constantly flows through us. The imagination is not something that I might have, that you might have. It shapes all things. And so shifting to a kind of service that's giving from the abundance within yourself, I think that's another fundamental shift of perspective that is struggling to be born in our times.
Amen to that. Mark, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to the audience for bearing with these two theoretical, wanting to talk. I've so thoroughly enjoyed this time with you, Mark, and the richness of your research, and I hope that the audience has as well. Don't go anywhere though. For the audience, there's one last thing, and that's the sneak peek of next week's show coming right up. And Mark, you'll get an invite to return. And all the best to you, and thank you.
Thank you. Good to talk about these things.
All right. Bye now. Hey everyone, it's Wade Franson. I am back in the studio recording a sneak peek for episode 204, airing on December 16th, which is this coming Tuesday at 8 Central Time, with Cy Hoekstra. Cy is a writer and an editor and a podcaster. And despite challenges that he's had, which we'll talk about in the show, his focus is really on faith and humor. Welcome to the studio, Cy.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure. So, Cy, how did you come to arrive at focusing on faith and humor in your writing and in your work with your Substack account, etc.?
I would say the Substack account mostly is humor writing about my experiences as a disabled person, and I think humor has always been a way that I express faith and hope in a way. Meaning, for me, it's not really something. And sometimes people hear about humor or comedy, whatever, coming from a place of frustration, a place of people exercising their demons kind of through comedy. That's very much not where I'm coming from. Like I come from a place where I've worked through a lot of those things with faith and emotional health and therapy. And humor to me is very much an expression of hope and in a belief that there is something brighter and more powerful out there than kind of the drudgery that we often see every day in our lives and in the news and things like that.
Well, I recently was reminded of, I think it was Norman Cousins who wrote the book Laughter is the Best Medicine, and he actually had a condition called ankylosing spondylitis, which I was actually diagnosed with when I was 28 years old, and I was told I'd be in a wheelchair by age 40. And I'm a little bit past that now. Don't know if you can hear it in my voice, but that didn't happen. And his book was instrumental to me. Are there specific touch points, whether it's in scripture or elsewhere, that you've used in reaching this conclusion and deciding on this focus?
It's a lot of what Jesus says to people who take themselves too seriously. This is not, I don't think this is like the primary thing that Jesus is teaching anybody, but a thing that I take away from when Jesus talks to religious leaders who put, too heavy a burden on people, or who are looking for applause and praise from other people. And that, I kind of, in my mind, I sort of condense all that down or synthesize that sometimes. One angle of all that is people who take themselves too seriously. Jesus is constantly inviting people to humility, and I think humor does the same thing. Generosity and hospitality. I think I'm blind, and a lot of the way that I talk about disability humor with regard to my disability, I think is very much aimed at hospitality toward and generosity toward people who don't understand blindness, and who have just who are ignorant about it, right? Through typically no fault of their own, to invite people to be able to talk about things that you're not necessarily supposed to talk about, or that you feel awkward talking about a lot of the time. I feel that all of that is tied up in how Jesus approaches humility and arrogance.
Well, and could not agree with you more. That is the very definition of the mind of Christ, right? Esteeming others better than oneself, that humility. And of course, then there's the famous John 13:35, by this shall all men know that you're my disciples, that you have love one for another. And this expression of love and humility and really forming relationships is something we're going to dive into deep. So I really look forward to that December 16th episode, where we'll have you live on the show and spend an hour unpacking this. So for everyone in the audience, you're not going to want to miss episode 204 on December 16th at 8 p.m. Central on Created in the Image of God. We'll see you there.